I sat quietly for 3 years while my sister called me lazy at every family dinner. Then Christmas happened and I ran out of patience. The lamb was perfect, the wine was poured, and my sister was looking at me across my parents' Christmas table with that expression I'd been watching my whole life, the one that meant a verdict was coming before the question was even asked. She said I wasn't applying myself, said I had nothing to show for it. Said it gently, the way she always did, which somehow made it worse. I didn't argue, I didn't explain. I just reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, and slid it across the table. 3 years of silence, 30 seconds of proof. The Hartwell family Christmas was never just a dinner, it was a courtroom. Cole Hartwell had understood that since he was 12 years old, sitting at the far end of the long oak table in his parents' house in Cincinnati, Ohio, watching his older sister Harper hold court like she'd been born with a gavel in her hand. She had a way of steering conversation that felt natural, almost effortless, a question here, a comment there, until you realized too late that the whole table had been subtly arranged into a jury, and you were the one on trial. This year, Cole was 28, Harper was 32, and nothing, it seemed, had changed. He pulled his car into the driveway of his parents' home on Cloverfield Lane just before 4 in the afternoon. The sky over Cincinnati was the color of old pewter, heavy with the kind of cold that didn't just bite. It settled into your bones and stayed there. Christmas lights blinked along the gutters. A wreath hung on the front door with a red bow that his mother, Diane, probably spent 40 minutes adjusting. She was particular like that. She cared about appearances. She always had. Cole sat in the car for a moment longer than necessary. Not because he was dreading the evening, well, not only because of that, but because he had learned over many years to give himself a breath before walking into that house, a small, private ritual. He pressed his hands flat against his thighs, exhaled slowly, and reminded himself of something Travis had said to him 2 weeks ago over beers at a bar on Montgomery Road. "You know what your problem is," Travis had said, leaning back in his chair with that easy grin he always wore. "You care too much about what people who don't understand you think about you." Travis Kemp had been Cole's best friend since college. He had the particular gift of saying true things plainly, without dressing them up or softening the edges. Cole had carried those words around since that night, like a stone in his pocket, something to press his thumb against when he needed grounding. He got out of the car. Inside, the house smelled like it always did at Christmas. Pine needles, his mother's rosemary lamb, and something sweet baking in the oven. Probably the cranberry cake she made every year from a recipe her own mother had passed down. Diane appeared from the kitchen almost immediately, wiping her hands on a dish towel and pulling Cole into a hug that lasted exactly the right amount of time. "You look thin," she said, pulling back to study his face. "I'm fine, Mom." "Are you eating?" "Every day, multiple times." She made a sound that was not quite satisfied but close enough and disappeared back into the kitchen. His father, Gerald, was in the living room watching a college bowl game on mute, a habit Cole had never fully understood. Gerald Hartwell was a man of quiet routines and mild opinions, someone who had built his life around not making waves. He shook Cole's hand warmly when he came into the room, asked about the drive, and then turned back to the game. Harper arrived 20 minutes later with her husband Patrick Stowe, who was tall and good-looking in the way that seemed designed specifically to reassure other people. He worked in pharmaceutical sales and spoke in the tones of someone who had attended exactly the right number of networking events. He shook hands with Gerald, kissed Diane on the cheek, and said the house looked beautiful, which it did. Harper herself came in already mid-sentence, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the particular smile she reserved for family gatherings. Warm on the surface, calibrated underneath. She hugged Cole last. "Cole," she said, "you made it." "Every year," he said. "You look tired." I'm good, Harp. Are you still doing the... She made a small, vague gesture with her hand. The thing? The app thing? The thing. The app thing. Cole had spent the last 3 years building a software company. He had incorporated it in Delaware, hired 6 full-time employees, scaled it to a monthly recurring revenue that would have made Harper's jaw drop if she knew what the numbers were. But Harper didn't know, because Cole had never told her, because Cole had learned early that telling Harper things gave her material to work with, and Harper was very good at what she did with material. "Yeah," he said, still doing the thing. Dinner was served at 6. The lamb was perfect, as always. Diane had also made roasted potatoes, green beans with almonds, a salad nobody touched, and the cranberry cake, which sat on the kitchen counter in patient anticipation of dessert. They talked about ordinary things: Patrick's sales numbers, which were apparently excellent, a neighbor's house renovation, which had apparently violated several codes, a cousin's upcoming wedding, which Diane approved of and Gerald had no opinion on. Cole ate and listened and said the right things at the right moments, which was a skill he had developed with some deliberateness. He had spent years being accused of being too quiet at these dinners, too withdrawn, too preoccupied with whatever it was he was spending his time on. He had learned to counteract this by being present enough to register, but not so present as to invite extended scrutiny. He was managing just fine until Harper refilled her wine glass, set the bottle down with a soft click, and looked across the table at him with an expression of careful concern that Cole recognized immediately. It was the face she wore right before she said something she had already decided to say. "Cole," she began, "and I say this because I love you. You know that, right? But Mom mentioned you didn't make it to Aunt Carol's birthday dinner last month, and you cancelled on Dad's fishing trip, and I just wonder sometimes if you're—" She paused, tilting her head slightly. "If you're really applying yourself. You know, like, you've always been so smart, but smart doesn't mean anything if you're not channeling it somewhere." The table went quiet in the way that tables go quiet when something has been said that everyone heard, but nobody is ready to address directly. Cole set down his fork. "What do you mean by applying myself?" he asked. His voice was calm. He had practiced calm. "I just think," Harper said, reaching for her wine again, "that at 28 you should have more to show for it. Patrick had his first regional management promotion at 26. She glanced at Patrick, who nodded with practiced modesty. "I'm not comparing. It sounds like comparing," Cole said. "I'm being honest because I care." She set her glass down. "Mom, back me up here. You've said the same thing." Diane, to her credit, looked uncomfortable. "I just worry," she said softly. "That's all." Gerald said nothing, which was what Gerald always said. Harper continued, "You're always working on something, but nothing ever seems to materialize. You live in that apartment. I like my apartment. And you never talk about what you're actually doing. And honestly, Cole, I think sometimes the reason you don't talk about it is because there's not much to talk about." She said it gently, almost kindly, which was somehow the worst version of it. It's okay to admit that something isn't working. It takes real strength to pivot. Cole looked at his sister across the table. He looked at the wine in her glass, the careful expression on her face, the slight lean of her posture that telegraphed authority. He thought about the last 3 years. He thought about Travis. He thought about the stone in his pocket. And then, quietly, he reached for his phone. The phone was in his jacket pocket, which was hanging on the back of his chair. Cole turned slightly, unzipped the inner pocket, and pulled it out. He set it on the table next to his plate with a soft, deliberate sound that nobody at the table could quite interpret. "What are you doing?" Harper asked. "1 second, Cole said. He unlocked the phone, opened his banking app. The business account, not his personal one, there was a distinction that mattered, and navigated to the summary page. He glanced at it once, to confirm what he already knew was there. and then he turned the screen toward the center of the table and slid it a few inches toward his sister. He didn't say anything. He just let her look. Harper's eyes moved to the screen. Cole watched her face go through several expressions in rapid succession. Skepticism first, then the slight narrowing of someone reading carefully, then something that might have been confusion, and then, very briefly, and then quickly buried, something that looked unmistakably like shock. "That's," she started. "My account summary," Cole said. "Business account. Current balance, plus the trailing 12 months of revenue." Patrick leaned slightly to the left to see the screen. His expression shifted too, though his face was better trained at neutrality. Diane had turned in her chair and was looking at Cole with wide eyes, not at the phone. Gerald reached for his water glass and took a long, slow sip. The number on the screen was not ostentatious. It wasn't the kind of number that appeared in magazine profiles of 20-something tech founders who had raised venture capital and burned through it hosting parties. It was quieter than that. It was the number of someone who had worked carefully, deliberately, without fanfare or announcement, building something real in the spaces between other people's opinions of him. It represented 3 years of early mornings, of weekends that didn't feel like weekends, of conversations not had, and vacations not taken, and fishing trips missed, and birthday dinners skipped. Not because Cole didn't want to go, but because he had understood, with a clarity that had sometimes felt lonely, that the window of time he was working with was finite and specific. He pulled the phone back and set it face down on the table. "I didn't show you that to make a point," he said, which was partially true. "I showed you that because you asked why nothing materializes." The table was very quiet. Harper put her wineglass down. For once, she didn't immediately pick it back up. "Cole," his mother said softly, "we didn't know." "I know you didn't." "Why didn't you ever—" "Because every time I talked about what I was working on, it got turned into a conversation about whether I was being realistic." He said it without heat, without accusation, just the plain fact of it. "So I stopped talking about it and just worked on it instead." His father spoke for the first time in what felt like the entire evening. "What exactly is the business?" Gerald asked. His voice was careful, curious, and slightly guilty all at once. Cole explained it as simply as he could. He had built a software platform for small medical and dental practices, the kind of independent offices that couldn't afford the enterprise systems the big hospital networks used, but still needed to manage scheduling, billing, patient communications, and compliance documentation without drowning in paperwork. He had started with one client, a dental practice in Blue Ash, and had grown from there. He now had clients in 11 states. He had a team. He had recurring contracts. He had not talked about it at family dinners, because talking about it at family dinners had always, previously, resulted in some version of the same response, a polite, careful skepticism that carried within it the assumption that Cole was describing a dream rather than a reality. As he spoke, he watched Harper's face. She had composed herself by now. Harper always composed herself quickly. It was one of her genuine skills. But underneath the composure, Cole could see something shifting. Not guilt exactly, or not only guilt, something more complicated than that. "That's impressive," Patrick said, and Cole believed he actually meant it, because Patrick understood numbers in a way that made his admiration immediate and unqualified. "Seriously, Cole, that's a real business." "It is a real business," Cole agreed mildly. "Why didn't you tell us?" Diane asked again. There was real hurt in her voice, and Cole felt it, because his mother's hurt had always landed differently than Harper's criticism. Softer, more genuine, harder to dismiss. "I told you I was working on something," he said. "I just didn't give you the quarterly reports." Harper had been quiet for longer than Cole could remember her being quiet at a dinner table. She was looking at the tablecloth. Her fingers were wrapped around the base of her wine glass, not drinking, just holding. "How long has it been—" She started, then stopped, then tried again. "How long has it been profitable?" 18 months. She absorbed that. 18 months, which meant that for the last year and a half, every time she had offered her gentle, careful concerns about whether Cole was applying himself, every dinner, every phone call, every pointed question about whether he was being realistic, he had been sitting on the knowledge that the thing he had built was already working. Cole hadn't corrected her. He had just listened and nodded and then gone back to work. "You could have said something," she said, and her voice had lost its usual precision. "I know," Cole said. "I chose not to." There was a difference in those two sentences that neither of them needed to articulate. The choice had been deliberate. The silence had been a kind of armor, and also Cole was beginning to understand, a kind of test, not one he had designed consciously, but one that the situation had constructed around him anyway. He had been waiting, maybe without fully knowing it, to see how long the criticism would continue before it had to confront reality. The answer, it turned out, was 3 years. Diane excused herself to check on the cranberry cake. Gerald refilled his water glass. Patrick began a careful, professional conversation with Cole about market size and expansion strategy, which Cole engaged with willingly because Patrick's questions were intelligent and he hadn't had anyone in his family ask intelligent questions about his work before. Harper sat quietly at her end of the table. She was not a bad person. Cole had always known that. She was someone who had organized the world around a certain set of assumptions, and those assumptions had just encountered a fact they could not accommodate. That took time to process. He understood that even if part of him, the part that had listened to 3 years of gentle condescension, didn't feel especially generous about it in this particular moment, Travis would have found the whole thing hilarious. Cole made a mental note to call him tomorrow. The cranberry cake was served at 7:30. Diane had put it on a white plate with a small sprig of holly at the base, which was the kind of detail she always remembered. Cole ate 2 slices. They were as good as they always were. The conversation at the dessert table was different from the conversation at the dinner table, lighter, more careful in a different way, careful not to push against anything, careful to stay on safe ground. Patrick talked about a conference he was attending in January. Gerald asked Cole about his team, how many people, where they worked from. Cole answered. Diane kept offering more cake, which was her preferred method of emotional regulation. And Harper, sitting across from Cole with a cup of coffee she wasn't really drinking, finally looked up and said, "I'm sorry. About what I said earlier." Cole looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. "It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It wasn't the closing of anything. It was just an acknowledgement, the beginning of something that would need more than one Christmas dinner to fully work out." But it was there, and Cole noted it, and tucked it somewhere alongside the stone in his pocket, and the memory of Travis's voice, and the quiet accumulating weight of 3 years of work that had finally, in the most unexpected way, been allowed to speak for itself. Cole drove home through Cincinnati at just past 10 at night, the city quiet and cold around him, Christmas lights still blinking on the houses he passed. The heater in his car worked well, but he kept it low. He needed to feel the edge of the cold. It helped him think. He had left the dinner table feeling something he hadn't entirely expected. Not triumph exactly, and not relief, though there was some of that too. What he felt was closer to a strange, hollow loosening, the way a muscle feels after you finally release a tension you've been holding so long you forgot it was there. 3 years of silence. 3 years of letting Harper's voice fill the space where his defense could have been. 3 years of choosing, every single time, to just go back and work instead of explaining himself. He wasn't sure if that had been wisdom or stubbornness. Maybe both. Maybe the difference between them was just a matter of outcome. His apartment was on the fourth floor of a building near Hyde Park. Nothing dramatic, 2 bedrooms. The second one converted into a home office that contained, in Travis's words, the most aggressively organized workspace I've ever seen in a residential building. Cole had the kind of mind that needed external order to match the internal complexity. Everything had a place. Every system had a logic. His desk faced east, so he got morning light. His monitors were calibrated. His coffee maker was on a timer. He poured himself a glass of water in the kitchen and stood at the window looking out at the street below. A couple walked past, bundled in coats, close together. A car moved slowly through the intersection. Somewhere down the block, someone was still playing Christmas music. Faint, muffled, almost abstract. He thought about the look on Harper's face when she saw the screen. He had rehearsed that moment in various forms for a long time. Not consciously, not deliberately. He hadn't sat down and planned a Christmas confrontation. But the image had existed in the back of his mind the way some images do, blurry around the edges, hypothetical, like a rough sketch of something you haven't yet decided whether to build. And now that it had happened, the reality of it was both more and less than he had imagined. More, because the silence afterward had been profound. Less because he had expected to feel more satisfied by it. He called Travis at 11, knowing Travis would be awake. Travis was always awake until at least midnight. "How was it?" Travis answered without preamble. "Interesting," Cole said. "Did Harper do the thing where she asks about your career in that tone that isn't technically a question?" "She called me lazy." A pause. "She actually said that word. She said I wasn't applying myself. She said I had nothing to show for it. She said—" Cole paused because recounting it made the evening suddenly more concrete again. "She made it sound like I was still the kid who couldn't get his act together. And then I showed her my bank statement." Another pause, longer this time. Then Travis said, "No." "Yeah." "The business account?" "Yeah." "Cole." Travis's voice had shifted into something between admiration and glee. "Cole, tell me everything," Cole told him. Travis listened with the particular focused attention he deployed when something genuinely interested him, which was not always, but when it happened, was total. By the time Cole finished, Travis had laughed twice, gone quiet once in a way that felt like respect, and finally said, "She apologized." "Yeah, at dessert. Was it a real apology or a Harper apology?" Cole considered this. It was a fair distinction. Harper was capable of both. It was... He thought about the way she'd looked at the tablecloth, the slight roughness in her voice. It felt real. I don't know. I think she was genuinely processing. "Are you going to call her?" "Not tonight, but eventually." "Yeah, eventually." Travis was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel?" It was the kind of question Travis asked that other people usually didn't. Cole sat with it. "Like I expected to feel more vindicated," he said honestly. "But it doesn't feel as good as I thought it would. Showing her, I mean. It was the right thing to do, but it wasn't. It wasn't satisfying in the way I'd imagined. Because you didn't do all of this to prove something to her." "No," Cole agreed. "I didn't. You did it for yourself." "Yeah. So the bank statement is just a fact. It's not a victory. It's not a trophy. It's just the truth." Cole exhaled. "Yeah, that's exactly what it is." He slept better than he expected to. He was up by 6:30 the next morning, old habit, unavoidable, and made coffee and sat at his desk and opened his laptop without immediately checking anything urgent. He just sat in the early light of the day after Christmas, the apartment quiet, and thought about what came next, because something did come next. That was the part he hadn't fully thought through before last night. The reveal wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of something. A different kind of relationship with his family, maybe. A different set of expectations, a different kind of conversation. His mother would want to know more now. His father would probably ask more questions, the slow and careful kind he was good at. And Harper. Harper was the variable he couldn't fully calculate. She wasn't someone who processed things simply. She had a way of reorganizing new information around her existing architecture rather than rebuilding the architecture itself, which meant that what had happened at dinner would work its way through her in stages, and the version of her that came out the other side might be genuinely changed, or might be the same with new vocabulary, or might be something in between. Cole didn't know yet which it would be. What he knew was that he had spent 3 years building something in the dark by his own internal compass, and it had worked. And now that it was no longer a secret, or at least no longer a secret from the people who had most needed to understand it, he felt, underneath the complicated feelings about Harper and the dinner table and the look on his mother's face, a quieter and more stable thing, the simple satisfaction of having done what he said he was going to do. He had told himself 3 years ago, standing in the parking lot of a dental office in Blue Ash, Ohio, that he was going to build something real. He'd said it to himself quietly with no witnesses. He had. And now he was sitting in the morning light on the day after Christmas, coffee cooling beside him, thinking about what to build next. The first email of the day came in at 7:15. A practice manager in Nashville, Tennessee, who had been in conversation with his sales team for 3 weeks. She was ready to sign a contract. Cole read the email twice. Then he typed his reply. Work continued, as it always had, as it always would. Harper called on the 27th. Cole saw her name on the screen and felt the familiar small tightening in his chest that had always accompanied his sister's calls. Not dread, exactly, but a kind of readiness, the way your body prepares for something before your mind has fully decided what it is. He let it ring twice, then answered. "Hey," she said. "Hey." A pause that wasn't awkward so much as deliberate. Harper was composing herself. Cole recognized the interval. "I've been thinking," she said, about the dinner, about what I said." Another pause. "About a lot of things, actually." Cole leaned back in his chair. Through the window of his office, the sky was the flat grey of late December stripped of snow. The city moved below him in its quiet, post-holiday rhythm. "Go ahead," he said. "I owe you more than what I said at dessert," Harper began. "I owe you a real conversation, not just, 'I'm sorry,' over cranberry cake." That was fair. He gave her the space to continue. "I've been sitting with this since I got home, and I think I have to be honest with myself about something." She was speaking carefully, but without the usual architectural precision that made her speech feel managed. This was different. This was something closer to unguarded. "I think I've had a narrative about you in my head for a very long time. And I built evidence for it every time I saw you, and I dismissed evidence against it because it didn't fit what I expected." Cole said nothing. "You know what's strange?" Harper continued. "The things I called you out on. Missing dinners, not showing up to things. You were absent because you were working. I just assumed the absence was laziness. I never asked. I just filled in the blank with what I thought I knew." "You never asked," Cole confirmed gently. "I know." Her voice was quieter now. "And that's on me." Cole stood up from his desk and walked to the window. 3 stories below, a woman was walking a dog in a puffy orange coat, the dog investigating every inch of the sidewalk with intense methodical focus. Cole watched them for a moment. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Please." It wasn't just about the work. I mean, the work was real, and the success is real, and I'm genuinely proud of what I've built. But the reason I didn't tell anyone, he stopped, organized his thoughts. It wasn't strategic. I didn't keep quiet because I was planning some big reveal. I kept quiet because every time I started talking about it, something happened in the room. Not just with you, With Mom, with Dad, with everyone, there was this shift, and I could see it, where whatever I said got translated into Cole is being optimistic again, and I got tired of the translation. So you stopped talking. So I stopped talking, he said, and I just worked. Harper was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, lower, stripped of its usual smooth confidence. That's an incredibly lonely thing to do. Cole had not expected her to say that. He found, unexpectedly, that it landed somewhere. It was, he said, sometimes. Were you angry? At us? He thought about it honestly. Not angry, he said finally. More like resigned. I had decided that whether or not you understood what I was doing wasn't the point. The point was whether I understood it, whether I believed it. And I did. And you were right. I was right about the business, he said. I might have been wrong about the isolation. That surprised her. He could hear it in the way she drew a small breath. What do you mean? I mean, I made a choice to protect myself by disappearing into the work, and it worked, and I don't regret it. But... He paused, watching the woman with the orange coat turn the corner and disappear. I think I also let something atrophy, the ability to be known, to let people be wrong about me and still stay in the room. I got good at leaving, at being somewhere else. You were at every dinner, Harper said. My body was, Cole said. I've been managing distance for 3 years. Harper was quiet long enough that Cole checked the phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. I don't know what to do with that, she finally said. Neither do I, Cole admitted, but I think naming it is probably the first step. The conversation shifted after that, not toward resolution exactly, but toward something softer. The early, tentative mapping of territory that had been closed off for a long time. Harper asked him about the business in the way people ask about things they genuinely don't understand but want to, carefully, without pretending they already know. She asked what a typical day looked like, how he managed the team, what the hardest part had been. Cole answered honestly. He found, to his slight surprise, that he wanted to. At some point, she said, Patrick was impressed, you know. He kept saying on the drive home, your brother built a real business, Harp. That's serious. Cole laughed a little. Patrick's all right. He is, Harper said, and there was something fond in her voice that made her sound, briefly, younger than 32. They talked for an hour and 15 minutes. By the end, nothing was resolved in the way resolutions are clean and final in movies. No speech, no catharsis, no orchestral swell. But something had moved. Something had shifted out of its fixed position and was now in motion, uncertain of where it would land, but undeniably no longer stuck. When they hung up, Cole sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He called his mother. Diane answered on the second ring, as she always did, as if she had been holding the phone in anticipation. They talked about the dinner, about Harper, about the business. Diane asked a lot of questions. Cole answered them all, this time without the managed distance, without the careful calibration of how much to reveal. He just talked. It felt, in the simplest possible way, like something coming back. I wish you'd told us sooner, Diane said near the end. I know, Mom. Not because of the money. That doesn't matter. She paused. Because you were going through something alone that you didn't have to go through alone. Cole thought about that for a long time after they hung up. She was right, and she was also, in a specific and important way, not quite right. Because the aloneness hadn't been entirely imposed from outside. Some of it had been chosen, some of it had been necessary. And some of it, he was only now beginning to understand, had become a habit that had outlasted its usefulness. He had built a business. He had built it well. He had done it with tremendous self-sufficiency and almost no external validation. Those were things to be proud of, But a person wasn't only what they could build alone, and the work, as good as it was, wasn't the only thing worth building. He made a note on his phone. It said only, "Don't let the walls become permanent." He read it once, then pocketed the phone and went back to work. January arrived in Cincinnati the way it always did, without ceremony, without softness, dropping the temperature and stripping the last of the holiday color from the streets until the city looked like it had been photographed in black and white. The Christmas lights came down on Cloverfield Lane. The wreath disappeared from his parents' door. The world returned to its ordinary operating mode. Cole noticed all of this from a distance, as he always did, because January was historically one of his most productive months. Something about the austerity of it suited him, the year clearing its throat before it began. But January this year was different in small, specific ways. His mother called every Tuesday, not long calls, 15, 20 minutes, but consistent, intentional, the kind of calls that said, "I'm thinking about you," without having to say it directly. They talked about his week, about hers, about the neighbor's ongoing renovation drama, about the practice in Nashville that had signed the contract and become his largest client yet. Diane had started keeping notes about his clients, he realized at some point, because she began asking follow-up questions that demonstrated retention. "How's the Nashville practice doing? Did the billing integration work out?" It was a small thing. It meant a great deal. His father called once, which was unusual enough to be notable. Gerald Hartwell was not a phone call person. He was a standing in the same room watching a game person, a handshake person, a man who communicated in the language of shared physical proximity rather than words. But he called on a Saturday morning, and they talked for 35 minutes about the business, the mechanics of it, the structure, the risks and the margins. And Cole realized, talking to him, that Gerald Hartwell understood business considerably better than Cole had assumed. He had run a small contracting company for 20 years. He had made payroll and managed vendors and navigated lean years without ever framing any of it as interesting or instructive. He had just done it quietly, the same way Cole had built his company quietly. "You're more like me than you know," Gerald said near the end of the call, in his careful, unadorned way. Cole sat with that for a while after they hung up. Harper took longer, which was expected and appropriate. The phone call on the 27th had opened a door, but doors take time to walk through. They texted occasionally, practical things at first, a shared article about healthcare software, a question from Harper about a podcast she'd heard that touched on the kind of market Cole was operating in. Gradually, the texts became less practical and more personal. By mid-February, they were having what Cole would have described carefully as a real correspondence. She called him on a Thursday evening in late January, not to resume the Christmas conversation specifically, but for no particular reason, which was itself the particular reason. She was calling just to talk. They talked about a book she was reading, and a project Cole's team was in the middle of, and something stupid Patrick had said that had turned out to be accidentally profound. The call lasted 45 minutes and ended easily, the way calls end when there's no unresolved agenda pulling at them. Cole hung up and realized he was smiling. He called Travis to report this development, because Travis was the kind of friend who kept score of the important things in a person's life, even when that person was too inside the experience to track it properly. "She just called to call," Cole said. "Without an agenda." "Without an agenda." Travis made a low sound of appreciation. "That's a significant data point." "I thought so." "How did it feel?" Cole considered. "Normal," he said. "It felt normal. Like she was just my sister." "Which she is." "Which she is." The business continued to grow, as it had been growing, as it would continue to grow, not in the explosive, headline-generating way of startup culture, but in the steady, compounding way of something built on actual value rather than projected value. Cole added 2 new clients in January, 3 in February. His team grew by one, a customer success manager named Renata, who had come from a healthcare consulting background and was startlingly good at her job. The Nashville practice became a reference client. A referral from that practice brought in a pediatric group in Memphis. Cole went to Cincinnati for his mother's birthday dinner in March. It was the first time he had been back to Cloverfield Lane since Christmas, and the house looked different in March, smaller somehow, or maybe more ordinary, stripped of the formality that holidays imposed. Diane had made the same rosemary lamb, which she made for every occasion that she felt deserved acknowledgement, and his father was in the living room watching a game with the sound on this time. Harper was already there when Cole arrived. She was helping their mother set the table, and she looked up when Cole came through the door with the same face she'd always had, the careful, organized face of someone who had always been good at managing rooms, but also, Cole noticed, with something slightly loosened in it. A held breath released. She crossed the room and hugged him first, before their mother did, which had never happened before. "Hey," she said. "Hey," he said. They sat at the same table. The same chairs, the same plates, the same cranberry-scented candle Diane always put in the center, but the air was different. Cole noticed it the way you notice the absence of a sound that you've grown so accustomed to, you stopped hearing it. Only now, in its absence, you realize how constant it had been. There was no verdict being assembled, no jury being quietly arranged. Harper talked about a project she was working on, about a challenge she was having with a colleague at the firm, and she asked Cole's opinion with a directness that indicated she was actually interested in his perspective rather than using the question as a setup for her own. Cole gave his honest assessment. She pushed back on part of it. He reconsidered and acknowledged the pushback. It was the first professional conversation he could remember having with his sister that hadn't been structured around a subtle hierarchy. Patrick asked follow-up questions about the Memphis referral and made a comment about market expansion timing that was genuinely useful. Gerald told a story about a difficult vendor from the early years of his contracting business that was so relevant to a current situation in Cole's company that Cole found himself taking notes on his phone, which made Gerald quietly pleased in the way he was never fully able to conceal. And his mother refilled everyone's water glasses and moved between the kitchen and the table and looked at her family with the particular expression she wore when something had settled correctly. Not perfect, never perfect, but settled, in the right configuration. After dinner, Cole and Harper stood in the backyard, while Gerald and Patrick watched the game inside. The March air was cold, but not bitter. The sky had cleared and there were stars. "I've been thinking," Harper said, "about what you said, about the isolation becoming a habit." Cole waited. "I think I did that too," she said. "Just differently. I built this whole system of being the one who had things figured out, and I used it to manage distance from anything that might complicate that picture." She looked out at the yard. "You from below, me from above. We were both doing the same thing." Cole hadn't considered it in exactly that framing before, and he found that it rearranged something in him slightly, not uncomfortably, but meaningfully. "Maybe we're more alike than we know," he said. Harper glanced at him. "You sound like Dad." "I'll take it." She laughed, and it was a genuine laugh, unguarded, nothing managed about it, just his sister, standing in their parents' backyard in the March cold, finding something actually funny. Cole hadn't heard her laugh like that in a long time, and he hadn't realized until now how much he'd missed it. He drove home later than he'd planned. The city was quieter at this hour, the streets nearly empty. He drove through Hyde Park and past the bar on Montgomery Road, where Travis had told him the true thing about caring too much, and past the dental office in Blue Ash, where he had stood in a parking lot 3 years ago and made himself a promise. He thought about what he had built, the company, the revenue, the clients in 11 states, the team, the recurring contracts, the Nashville practice that had told 3 other people about his platform. He thought about the bank statement on the Christmas dinner table and his sister's face and the way his father had said, "You're more like me than you know." He thought about what he was still building, the relationship with his family, the capacity to be known, the practice of not letting walls become permanent. Both things were real. Both things were his. He pulled into the parking garage of his building and sat in the car for a moment before going up. An old habit, his private ritual. He pressed his hands flat against his thighs. He had not built the business to prove anything to anyone. He had built it because he had seen something that didn't exist and understood he was capable of making it exist. The Christmas dinner had not been the point. The bank statement had not been the point. The point, the whole point from the beginning, was that he had trusted himself when no one else did, and he had been right. Everything else was just what happened after. He got out of the car and went upstairs. His coffee maker was on its timer. His monitors were calibrated. His desk faced east. On his laptop, an email from the Memphis Pediatric Group sat in his inbox, subject line, "Ready to move forward." Cole sat down, opened the email and began to type. The next thing was already starting.